All right, now I'm going to be dealing with a claim made by Larry Elder that our ancestors, that is to say, African Americans, Afro diasporans, were not kidnapped. You see, you have people who want to say that they were not kidnapped because people were purchased. Okay, so now this is a book, The Law of Freedom and Bondage in the United States. I'm pretty sure that this book was written by a white person. The reason why I seek information from white people is so people cannot say, Coons cannot say, or people who are Afrocentric detractors cannot say, oh, that's revisionism or that's Afrocentrism or that's not something, if they'll find fault with it if it comes from a just straight from a black person. This is from John Cobden Hurd, 1858, The Law of Freedom and Bondage in the United States. And it says, for though in the earliest period of the intercourse of Europeans, the English included, with the African tribes, Negroes were kidnapped or piratically seized by force, and the practice had perhaps at first been considered lawful. And it goes on. And if, of course, if something is going on, I can't say, of course, you wouldn't know this, but something's funny with my scroll on this, so it's not gonna let you see the continuation. But now we'll go back into see what Larry Elder has to say, and here's him like think about that, guys, like he's being clever here. 12.5 million slaves kidnapped, and of course he's going to go on to tell you that they were bought. Now this is Blackstone was a British jurist. According to him, William Blackstone, writing in the late 1700s, described the law of kidnapping as forcible abduction or stealing away of a man, woman, or child from their own country and sending them into another. Isn't that indeed what happened? Weren't people uh, taken by force? Even looking at this picture here, we see people with yokes on their neck, and we see this guy, he's about to look like he's about to do this guy in. They're chained up. This clearly is not voluntary. So to say that they were not kidnapped and then to show this picture, this is dumb. They're clearly being marched somewhere. So it seems like it meets all of the criteria of being kidnapped. Now we're going to go into aiding and abetting. If anything, the Europeans, once they stopped, if they ever did stop taking people by themselves, it says elements of aiding and abetting. The elements necessary to convict under aiding and abetting theory are that the accused had specific intent to facilitate the commission of a crime by another. 2. That the accused had the requisite intent of the underlying substantive offense. 3. That the accused assisted or participated in the commission of the underlying substantive offense. And 4. That someone committed the underlying offense. Okay, now going into John Wesley. This is a this is an abolitionist. He worked between 1703 and 1791. And going on down, and down, he goes on into describing the type of country people were brought from. Um, Going on down. First, in what manner are they procured? Part of them by fraud. Captains of ships from time to time have invited Negroes to come on board and then carried them away. This is number one, okay? But far more have been procured by force. The Christians landing upon their coast seized as many as they found, men, women, and children, and transported them into America. It was about 1551 that the English began trading to Guinea, at first for gold and elephant's teeth, but soon after for men. In 1566, Sir John Hawkins sailed with two ships to Cape Verde, where he sent 80 men on the shore to catch Negroes. But the Negroes flying, they fell further down, and there sat the men and there set the men on shore to burn their towns and take the inhabitants. That's quote. But they met with such resistance that they had 7 men killed and took but 10 Negroes. So they went further down till having taken enough, they proceeded into the West Indies and sold them. And it goes into more detail about that, but you should, I'm giving away too much. People weren't researching. You need to research these things. Um, Two, it was some time before the Europeans found a more compendious way of procuring African slaves. So that means that they were just catching people for a while. And you have people saying, oh, they didn't catch people, that didn't happen. You know, yeah, they caught people. They'll tell you in their own books that they were catching people. Uh, it was some time before the Europeans found a more compendious way of procuring African slaves by prevailing upon them to make war upon each other and to sell their prisoners. Till then, they seldom had any wars, but were in general quiet and peaceable. But the white men first taught them drunkenness and avarice, and then hired them to sell one another. Nay, by this means, even their kings are induced to sell their own subjects. When you get into the whole thing about people selling their own subjects, this is why drugs and alcoholism, the people talk about they put drugs in the community. Same thing has pretty much been happening. Uh, it says, when the king of Barsali wants goods or brandy, he sends to the English governor at James Fort, who immediately sends a sloop against the time it arrives. He plunders some of his neighbor's towns, selling the people for the goods he wants. At other times, he falls upon one of his own towns and makes bold to sell his own subjects. So Monsieur Brou says, I wrote to the king not the same. If he had a sufficient number of slaves, I would treat with him. He seized 300 of his own people and sent word he was ready to deliver them for the goods. He adds, some of the natives are always ready when well paid to surprise and carry off their own countrymen. They come at night without noise, and if they find any lone college, surround it and carry off all the people. Many of the slaves sold by the Negroes are prisoners of war or taken in incursions they make into their enemies' territories. Others are stolen. Abundance of little blacks of both sexes are stolen away by their neighbors when found abroad on the road or in the woods, or else in the cornfields at the time when the parents them there all day to scare keep them there all day to scare away the devouring birds. That their own parents sell them is utterly false. So they were saying people were selling their own children. Anyways, and they tell you how they procured. So anyway, so it was a combination. Anyways, people were kidnapped under the definition of kidnapping. There's no way to get around that. And people there was aiding and abetting of a crime. Even here it says, uh, talk about 1556 again. Sir John Hawkins sailed from England to the West African coast and sent some 80 soldiers to kidnap Negroes. Let's see if we find anything else about kidnapping. Cases of Europeans kidnapping African elites go back to the earliest arrival of the Portuguese along the African coast and pose as serious. So they were again kidnapping. Alexander Falconbridge is somebody who mentioned kidnapping. Same document before. Again, aiding and abetting, where you help someone commit a crime. Again, what kidnapping is: forcible abduction or stealing away of a man, woman, or child from their own country and sending them into another. Let's even go into Falconbridge because he was someone involved in the slave trade. Kidnapping. Maybe Falcon. This is dealing with a place called Bonnie. Um, Previous to my being in this employ, meaning this before he got involved in the slave trade, I entertain the belief, as many others have done, that the kings and principal men bred Negroes for sale as we do cattle during the different times. So he thought that there are people just somehow just breeding people just to give them or sell them. He thought that. During the different times I was in the country, I took no little pains to satisfy myself in this particular, but notwithstanding I made many inquiries, I was not able to obtain the least intelligence of this being the case. All the information I could procure confirms me in the belief that to kidnapping and to crimes, many of these fabricated as a pretext, the slave trade owes its chief support. He goes on about how people were treated, how they're treated cruelly by both other black people and Europeans. But again, they were people were kidnapped. The kidnapping of Africans for slaves. Uh, the capture and kidnapping of Africans as part of the slave trade. The kidnapping of Africans for slaves. Recovered histories. Alexander Falconbridge background. In the 18th century, the majority of Africans sold into the transatlantic slave trade had been kidnapped. The remainder, and they all were kidnapped. It says Thomas Clarkson, he was another abolitionist, went to Africa to see for himself how this process was facilitated. October 19th, 1797, inquiring today of a Negro lad how he came into the situation of how October 19th, 1797, inquiring today of a Negro lad how he had come into the situation of a slave. He informed me that he had been stolen from his parents in the interior country of Cape Rouge, that the inhabitants of the shore usually came up in bodies for this purpose, and that they unfortunately met with him and brought him to Goree in company with others whom they had taken in the same manner. So, regardless of whether or not those people were black or white, he was kidnapped. Raids and attacks on villages were instigated for the same purpose. I was told by the natives. Clarkson also wrote that they intended to attack a village in the third night. I asked them if the inhabitants had done them any injury. They replied no, but there were a considerable number of fine, stout men belonging to it who were good for trade. This was their only reason. So they just had professional kidnappers. It says a man and his son, according to their own information, were seized by professed kidnappers while they were planting yams and sold for slaves. Talk about it for the slaves. It says Dr. Trotter asked a black trader what they made of their slaves when the English and French were at war. Was answered, when the ships ceased to come, slaves ceased to be taken. Example of how the Europeans were forced to nature by trade by threatening the inhabitants of the villages. The black sailors found on board, amounting to 19 in number, though they were free men and receiving wages, have all been sold for slaves. So it's another thing people will talk about how um, uh, Europeans, the British did so great by ending the slave trade. Basically, it says right here. So if people talk about supply and demand, the supply may have been coming from Africa, but the demand was coming from other people. Again, Dr. Charter asking a black trader what they made of their slaves when the English and French were at war was answered, when ships ceased to come, slaves ceased to be taken. So there's different interesting things we have here. But yeah, they mentioned people being, uh, let's see, what's another term? Okay, there was John. This gentleman, Slave Life in Georgia, a narrative of life, sufferings, and escape of John Brown, a fugitive slave now in England, documenting the American South. He mentions his grandfather being stolen from Africa. I think this person operated in 1854. Going on down, see this person. He says, my father's name was Joe. He was owned by a planter named Benford who lived in Northampton. In the same state, I believe my father and his family were bred in Benford's plantation. His father had been stolen from Africa. He was of the Igbo tribe. I remember seeing him once when he came to visit my mother. He was very black. I never saw him but one time, and though I was quite small, I have a distinct recollection of him. He and my mother were separated in consequence of his master's going off, and when my mother was forced to take another husband, she had 3 children by my father, myself, a brother, and sister twins. Okay, so anyways, that he mentions uh, his father's father being stolen from Africa. So again, When people talk about, people not being kidnapped, and let's even deal with, again, we deal with aiding and abetting. Let's deal with accessory. They have accessory after the fact. What does that mean? It says an accessory after the fact is someone who assists someone who has committed a crime after the person has committed the crime with knowledge that an accessory after the fact is someone who assists someone who has committed a crime after the person has committed the crime with knowledge that the person committed the crime and with the intent of help with the intent to help the person avoid arrest or punishment. An accessory after the fact might be held liable for among other things, obstruction of justice. Okay. So now there is accessory. You keep saying accessory after the fact. I think they should have one just accessory. Then we have fomenting. It says instigate or stir up an undesirable or violent sentiment or course of action. What about false imprisonment? Um, Overview. False imprisonment is an act punishable under criminal law as well under tort law. Under tort law, it is classified as an intentional tort. A person commits false imprisonment where he commits an act of restraint on another person which confines that person in a bounded area. So clearly, that is what the slave ships were. They were um, they were basically prisons. The slave dungeons or slave castles, as they dare call them, these were that was false imprisonment because there was no justification for it. It says doesn't have legal authority or justification, intentionally restrains another person's ability. Even going by the Bible, we'll say what man stealing. Let's go into even people's favorite KJV. It says right here, Exodus 21:16. And he that stealeth a man and selleth him, or if he be found in his hand, he shall surely be put to death. So there you have it. Obviously, these people are going uh, by force. This guy here looks like he's about to do him in, some violence to him, um, going back even to kidnapping. Under common law. And again, it says uh, a crime in common law consisting of an unlawful restraint of a person's liberty by force or show of force so as to send the victim into another country. Yeah, again, it says man stealing and slavery denounced by the Presbyterian. To denounce the act of stealing Negroes as expressly contrary to the law of God, bearing witness against the heinous crime of man stealing, order the Negroes to restore stealing Negroes. What about man stealing? Let's see what happens when I put this in. Religious intelligencer, A man steals human beings in Africa, stealing poor Africans, and yep, I think this is good. That's it.